Hi there, guys. Welcome back. I just want to sort of go into a little bit of the history of photography, right? This sort of lets us know sort of where we've come from, and also lets us know a little bit that not a whole lot has changed from when, like way back then in the 1800s, when they started playing around with light and trying to record light and fix it so they can have photos and stuff like we have today. Um, the Honestly, I don't like history very much. Like, I found it boring in school, whether it be high school or college, and maybe I just didn't take the right classes. But no offense to any history professors or history students. I just, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was never something that super interested in me. But I'm gonna have sort of a really light version here. It's gonna be a very brief history of photography. Basically, what I want to cover are some of the innovations that got us to where we are today, and some of the people, the photographers that helped improve those innovations and sort of spearheaded that, right? So what we're looking at right here is a blow up version of or an enlarged version of a cell phone or smartphone camera, right? And this is sort of super basic, but you'll know that all sort of cameras are sort of the same when it boils down to it, right? You got a prism that flips the light upside down. We'll go over that in a minute when we talk about camera obscuras. We have a lens, and then we have an image sensor, and then we have software. So basically, a smartphone is made up of only a couple components. The lens that allows the light to come through, right? And the lens can be either bigger and smaller, depending on some cameras, letting more light or less light in. Once the light goes through that lens, it hits an image sensor. And on that image sensor, the sensor records the light as it comes through. And then after that, there's software applied to it, which helps it out even more. Okay? And these days, a lot of AI is coming into it, and computational photography and stuff is huge. And they're doing a lot of stuff in photography with computers and software that helps imitate what we used to do in camera with the DSLR, right? Or any other normal camera. So let's look a little bit about what a normal camera sort of looks like and compare it to a smartphone. This right here is basically a normal camera, right? You've got a very similar idea where light comes through a lens in the very opening, right? It comes in. There's some other things in it, like there's a mirror, if it's a mirrorless camera that doesn't have a mirror. But basically, the rudimentary points, you guys, are light comes in, it hits a lens. The lenses can either open or close a little bit, depending on, again, the camera. And then from that, light comes in and hits a piece of film or a sensor, and that's how we get our image, right? This camera, of course, has a mirror and a shutter, which your smartphones have neither, right? It also has film, which smartphones, of course, don't have either, right? But if you're ever to open your DSLR and take the lens off, if you have a mirrorless camera, you'd look right into the sensor. If you have a DSLR that has a mirror, you're going to look and see a mirror. And if you click the shutter button down, the mirror will come up and it will reveal the sensor just like here, right? So what is basically happening is that your smartphone is a dark box, right? It's a dark room. It's light tight, so no other light can come in and mess stuff up and pollute the image or alter your image, right? Your camera is the exact same thing. So back in the day, back like in the 1800s and when they first started, painters used what's called a camera obscura, right? It comes from the Latin meaning dark room. And even in Italian today, camera means room and obscura means dark or obscure, right? So basically camera obscura means dark room. And that's where we got our cameras. That is a camera, right? Now, the difference between a camera obscura like this guy's using, where he's trying to replicate what he sees outside, because whatever's outside will broadcast on the wall if you create a dark room and put a tiny hole in the wall, right? And I'll show you guys some of the examples of this. But you'll notice it's also upside down, and I'll show you guys why it's upside down too. But this is where every camera comes from. Every camera, you guys, is a camera obscura, whether it be a smartphone, whether it be a normal camera or whatever, right? This is why it's upside down. Okay, so I'm not a big physics person, but you'll see that point A, if you look at it, the top of the flame, right? There's a straight line from the top of the flame that goes down and is upside down in the box, inside the box. And the reason that is light travels in a straight line. That's why it's upside down. If light was able to bend, as soon as it hit that little hole, right? And then and it'd be right side up. But light doesn't bend just because it goes through a hole. So what happens is as the object is upside down, when you see it on the plane in the box, that requires something to flip it, right? Flip it back up like like a prism in the old days, or software or something. But everything comes in upside down, right? Even in our eyes. Our eyes, if you guys look at them, our eyes are a lens, right? Basically, in our head is a camera obscura. Light comes in our eye, which is the little hole, right? It enters there, and then it creates and flips an upside down image on the back of our eye, and our computer brain helps flip it. Our software, right? Our brain flips it upside down, or right side up, excuse me. So one dude who's used camera obscura, which I never thought I'd see anybody ever use these, is his name is Abelardo Morel. He's a Portuguese photographer, and he creates these amazing camera obscuras in rooms all around where he travels. Now this is crazy, right? This is in his room, and this is outside of his room. How did he do this? Basically, he took black plastic or something to cover up all the windows and light in his room, and then he put a tiny hole in a black piece of plastic or the piece of aluminum foil or whatever over the window. He poked a tiny little hole in that and then waited about 5 to 10 minutes for his eyes to adjust. And this is what happened. This can happen in any one of your dorm rooms, right? This looks like it's Venice, and I think this is upside down because he didn't use a prism to rotate it, right? But this is his apartment in Venice. This is another, I think this is the countryside in Italy. But if you look, this is inside his place he's staying, and he turned it into a camera. The dude is literally sitting inside of a camera, or what's known as a camera obscura, right? And he's got an opening in the room. It's a tiny little opening, a little hole, which lets light come through. That's his lens. It broadcasts on the back of this wall. And unlike our cameras, there's nothing to really record it, right? And keep it stuck there, or there's no sensor or film. It's just literally on the dude's wall, which I think is absolutely fascinating. Here's another one. Again, camera obscura, you guys. This is basically a dark room, and he turned his dark room into a camera. Okay. Now, this right here is basically what we did in class. Now, when we had this in person, I turned our classroom into a camera obscura, right? I poked a little hole in the door and opened the door, covered it with plastic, and poked a little hole in it. And then we all waited until it showed up. And this dude showed up on the wall, and this is like right outside our classroom. This is right by Butte Station. And you'll notice it is upside down. You can see the garbage cans and stuff outside, the trees and the cement on the ground. And here I think I've rotated it and flipped it up. Yeah, here it is right side up. And all we did was take a photo of this with our phones, right? And I just flipped this upside down so you could see it. But this is what the image on the wall looked like from a tiny hole poked in a piece of plastic that covered our door. This is how they used to do this. I think it's super fascinating, right? So I want to get to like who started this whole phenomenon, who started this whole, trying to make cameras and trying to fix an image, right? Which is super important. And the dude who did it and is credited with it, his name is Nicéphore Niepce. And I don't even know if I'm saying that right. My French pronunciation is just absolutely awful, awful bad. And so don't even don't judge, right? But basically this guy, in the window of his upper story workroom in his country house, he set up a camera obscura and he placed within it a polished pewter plate, which is metal, and he coated it with bitumen of Judea, which is sort of like an asphalt. It's like an asphalt type derivative like petroleum. And then he took the lens off. After a day-long exposure of 8 hours, the plate was removed and the latent image of the view from the window was rendered visible by washing it with a mixture of oil of lavender and white petroleum, which dissolved away the parts of the bitumen that had not been hardened by light, right? So the result was a sort of a permanent direct positive that you can source. This is a one-of-a-kind photograph, right? And basically this is it right here. The exposure, though, took 8 hours, which is really, really long to be making a photograph, right? So in time, this exposure time got a lot faster, right? I mean, and you could barely almost not make even out this, what do you call it? You could barely make out this image, right? What it is. But I mean, give the guy credit, like he's trying, right? And he's experimenting and stuff, and he's doing his best. And I mean, for people who didn't know anything about any of this technology, I think it's a pretty good, what do you call it? A pretty good attempt, right? So this is William Henry Fox Talbot. We're just going to call him Talbot, or Fox Talbot for short. Now, Henry or Talbot, he made what's called the calotype, and he was one of the early competitors along with Nipsey. I'm just going to call that guy NN because I don't want to pronounce his name over and over. So the original dude NN, right, who created the first photograph, he was sort of a contemporary of Talbot, and they lived about the same time. Now, Talbot was experimenting with a little bit of a different type of process. He used negatives, which were made using paper, right? And he coated them with silver iodide and other chemicals. Now, one thing that was great about Talbot's invention is that you could make copies of it, right? That was absolutely fantastic. So Nipsey, or NN, his was a one of a kind, like a Polaroid. You could only make one, and then you had to do another one, right? Because you had to coat it with that asphalt-like type stuff and whatever. Where this guy, Talbot, he made ones that you could make copies of. So if you really liked a photo of your family, or if you really liked a photo of the mountains, you could actually have it. You actually had sort of a paper negative, and you could make copies of it and have multiples, which was flipping great, right? Only downside was they were sort of soft, right? They weren't very sharp. They were made out of paper, but the benefit was that copies could be made. So that's Talbot, right? So Talbot did not know, actually, well, he did not, he was English, right? And his contemporary, that was a direct competitor, his name was Louis Daguerre. And Daguerre, he was French. And so what happened was Daguerre was working on his sort of invention, right? And Talbot was working on his. And it turns out Talbot found out about Daguerre's, and he thought Daguerre ripped him off. So we'll go in a little bit later about what Daguerre did. Once Talbot was furious that Daguerre stole his technology from him. But long story short, Talbot wanted money for his, and he wanted to license it, right? So only people that paid the license fee could actually get his technology and use it. Okay. And so here's the image here's another image, another calotype, which I think they're really beautiful, right? But again, they're on paper and they're super soft, and of course they could be torn and stuff. They're sort of fragile. So yeah, you got to be sort of careful. Now here's his competitor, right? This is Louis Daguerre. Now Louis was working on similar stuff like Talbot, okay? And he basically, though his was on metal, okay? It was a silver covered copper plate. So he took a piece of copper, he coated it with silver, he exposed it to something super harmless, right? Mercury vapor. Dude. Yeah. Anyway, exposed it to mercury vapor, which probably wasn't known at the time to be deadly. And then he got his image, and it looks sort of like this, right? And I actually, if you guys want to see sort of the differences in these metal tintypes and daguerreotypes in these process, I have a couple daguerreotypes and I have a couple tintypes, and I've got a little video you guys can watch that sort of shows the difference between the two and what to look for if you're trying to maybe collect these. But one of the things nice about this, they're super sharp, right? If you'll see in some of my images, they're very, very sharp. They're not printed on paper where they're sort of soft. These were highly detailed, super sharp. Number two, they were one of a kind. Okay, you could not make copies of this, which was sort of a downside. The positive side of it was each one was super rare because it was one of a kind. The con was that, you couldn't make any copies. And lastly, they were printed on metal. Metal was super great because, you know what? Metal stays around a long time. It lasts a long time. It's very durable. And while these were a little bit sensitive, you could scratch them and stuff, they would last generally a lot longer than any kind of paper, right? So before we get going too far, right? Let's hear a little bit about from Daguerre himself, and I'll let you guys listen in and listen a little bit on Daguerre and his life a little bit, and what he sort of how he saw his life.
Bonjour everyone, my name is Louis Daguerre. I was born in Cormelles-en-Paris's Val d'Oise. I apprenticed in architecture, theater design, and panoramic painting to Pierre Prévost, the first French panorama painter. My mentors considered me exceedingly adept at theatrical illusion, and I eventually became a celebrated designer for the theater, and I later invented the diorama. In 1829, I partnered with Nice for Niepce, a pioneer in early photography processes. Despite his success, a camera exposure lasting hours or days was required for his images, but we later refined this process. Despite our efforts, long exposures were still required. Niepce died suddenly in 1833, but I continued experimenting and evolved the process which would subsequently be known as the daguerreotype. After efforts to interest private investors proved fruitless, I went public with my invention in 1839. At a joint meeting of the French Academy of Sciences and the Académie des Beaux-Arts on January 7th of that year, the invention was announced and described in general terms, but all specific details were withheld. Under assurances of strict confidentiality, I explained and demonstrated the process only to François Arago, the Academy's secretary, who proved to be an invaluable advocate for my process. Members of the Academy and other select individuals were only allowed to examine specimens at my studio. To my delight, images were enthusiastically praised as nearly miraculous, and news of the daguerreotype quickly spread. Now that my invention is public, I don't mind sharing the details behind its process. To begin the process, I exposed a thin silver-plated copper sheet to the vapor given off by iodine crystals, producing a coating of light-sensitive silver iodide on the surface. The plate was then exposed to light in the camera, much like exposing film or a sensor. This process, too, required a very long exposure to produce a distinct image, but I made the crucial discovery that an invisibly faint latent image created by a much shorter exposure could be chemically developed into a visible image. Upon seeing the image, the contents of which are unknown, I screamed, "I have seized the light! I have arrested its flight!" The metal plate produced an exact reproduction of the scene. The image was laterally reversed, as images in mirrors are, unless a mirror or inverting prism was used during exposure to flip the image. The surface of metal sheet was subject to tarnishing by prolonged exposure to the air and was so soft that it could be marred by the slightest friction, so we protected them by mounting in a small folding case with a glass cover. While daguerreotypes were usually portraits, the rarer landscape views and other unusual subjects are now much sought after by collectors and sell for much higher prices than ordinary portraits. Be careful not to confuse my process with a tintype. A true daguerreotype, when held at an angle, looks like a hologram. I made a deal with the French government to exchange my rights to my invention for lifetime pensions for myself and Niepce's son Isidore. Shortly thereafter, on August 19, 1839, the French government presented the invention as a gift from France free to the world, and complete working instructions were published. An Englishman named Henry Fox Talbot heard of my invention and thought I had stolen his idea. He wrote an open letter to the Academy claiming priority of invention. Because I thought that was shady, I had my agent, Miles Berry, apply for a British patent days before France declared my invention free to the world. The United Kingdom was the only country where my invention was not free and had to pay licensing fees. My contributions to photography lead to my name being one of the 72 names inscribed on the Eiffel Tower. If you happen to go there, see if you can find me.
So Daguerre was fascinating, right? I mean, can you imagine that dude? Not only was he, a great innovator, but he was hecka successful and very clever. I mean, the fact that he, a couple days before, he gave his, He gave his invention, the patent of it, he gave it freely to everybody and gave it to the French government, right, in exchange for like a pension for him and Inins, Nispor Nipses, I think it was his son. He gave it to everybody for free, right? But before he did so, a couple days before, he made sure that in Britain he patented it so that Brits had to pay, English people had to pay for it. They were the only country that had to pay for his invention, and it was all because Talbot sent a letter accusing Daguerre of ripping off his technology, right? So another important photographer, you guys, is Matthew Brady. He was one of the first American photographers. It's sort of why I cover him. It's also, I think, really important to note that Matthew Brady photographed the Civil War on like a mobile darkroom, right? And he was noted for bringing the Civil War home to the public. Like most people, unless you were in war, you had not seen dead bodies on the battlefield. You did not know how gruesome it was, right? So basically, this dude goes out and starts filming and taking photos of the war. Now, one of the things is, you guys will know or notice that during this time, it was really hard to have the shutter speeds and exposure times were really, really long. And so because of that, they had to have a ton of light or long exposure or both to expose their images properly, right? Which meant if you had your shutter open for a long time and there was movement that happened in the time the shutter was open during the exposure, dude, you would get blur. So what happened is Brady and his other fellow photographers had to make sure that if they were photographing a subject, that subject had to remain like 100% still for the entire duration of the photo when the shutter was open. So if it like took 20 seconds, right, to sit there and photograph somebody, you had to remain still for 20 seconds. You couldn't move, you couldn't fidget. If you breathed in and out, you would blur a little bit. You should not close your eyes, because if you do, you look like a wreck. You look like a zombie. So basically, you couldn't move. Yeah, shutter exposure times got faster, right, as technology got better. But during this guy's time and his contemporaries, man, people need to hold really still, which was why a lot of people, when they look back on these old photos, they look really stiff, right? I mean, look, here Lincoln, photographed by Matthew Brady, looks like he's a statue almost, right? Sitting perfectly, look at his posture, sitting perfectly erect. But and these guys too, okay? All of these guys standing, sitting perfectly erect. On the very left-hand side, you'll see the guy looks a little bit blurry, right? Who else looks blurry? There's another little blurry guy too that moved. A couple of these guys have moved, right? And that's why they look blurry. The ones that look the sharpest tend to be the ones that can hold their pose for the longest. And those guys are sharp. Like the guy, arms crossed, looks like a general, arms crossed, dead center, got that cool stoic look on his face. He has a very sharp face, sharp eyes. So does the gentleman next to him to his right. But if you look up in the very guy on the very left, who looks like he's missing his right arm, due maybe to some battle injury, he looks a little bit soft and out of focus. And it could be that he just sort of moved a little bit, right? So you could not move. That's why Matthew Brady was super successful photographing war, because all of these people aren't moving, right? Nobody moved. Nobody blurred his photo. He could set up his little mobile camera or mobile darkroom where he developed his film and prints. He would bring that around with a little horse and a little carriage, and he would develop his photos on the spot, right? So he would sit there and set his camera up. He would take these photos, and then he would develop them in his little carriage, and then he'd bring them home and show people so they could sort of see what war looked like, what the travesty of war and the sacrifice America was undergoing at this time. Again, here's another photo, right, from Matthew Brady. This shows some of the dangers and awful parts of war. On the left of this guy, you see this is a typical photographer's studio, right? You see the guy sitting down, and you see his head is in a clamp, right? That clamp is holding his head perfectly straight so he doesn't move it and blur the photo, right? I mean, imagine having to sit there and have this contraption attached to your neck and your back so that you didn't move for every selfie, for every photo you wanted to take of yourself. Hold on, guys. Let me go get this flippin' clamp with a handle and like gears and crap and clamps and attach it to my neck and my head so I won't move. I mean, this here was like this little thing you see here, this diagram was in a little, what are those called? They're like a magazine or like a little thing you could order, like props and stuff and things out of like a catalog for photographers, right? This was in there, and something you could buy and something you're encouraged to buy to have your subjects hold still. Now, people held so still that, I mean, they almost look like they were dead, right? I mean, if you look at these people look like corpses to me. Like they're all washed out. I don't know. And they look so flippin' stiff and straight that some people even thought they were dead, right? But no, they all got clamp. A lot of them have clamps on the back of their neck so they can't they can't move, and therefore they're sharp, right? Now, this one though is a little suspect. Maybe his mom's got her hand, or dad's got his hand, or somebody's got their hand out from the curtain as holding his head straight so he doesn't move. And it looks like at the very bottom between his legs you can see a stand. Now, unfortunately, some of these photos have been confused with corpse photography or death photography. Back in this time, that was very prolific. People would photograph their corpses of their loved ones, i.e. like their cadavers, their dead bodies. They'd photograph them and stage them and pose them. Now, one of the ways they said you could determine whether it was a corpse photo or a live photo was generally corpses couldn't stand up even when supported by that bracket. So if they were a corpse, they'd sit them in a chair and they'd lay them down, or they'd make it so that they didn't have to stand at all. So generally, if you guys are looking over dead photos, I think this gal's dead, you would find that most of them that are the ones that are standing up, I think are clearly alive, right? Although this little girl at the very end, she doesn't look alive either. Right? And I'm wondering, because the little boy next to her looks disturbed, and it could be that he's standing next to his little dead sister. I'm not sure, right? But this guy's dead, right? You could pose him and put him in different shapes. You could put them in different poses, right? I think this daughter's dead here. And again, it was only the ones that are laying down that were dead. On the photo on the left, I think that little kid may be dead. I'm pretty sure the one on the right is dead. She's holding her sister's hand. Okay? And again, if they're held or they're lying on something, they're generally corpse photography. If they're not, like this, would you think that woman, that little girl between these two guys would be a corpse because some fool like colored her eyes out and stuff? I don't think so. I think she's got a stand directly behind her. You can see that at the bottom of her feet, but I honestly think she's alive. Like I'd have to do some more research in this. But from what experts have said, they don't think that a body could have been held up and supported by these, what do you call them? These brackets, right? They just weren't heavy enough to sustain and hold a human being, right? Now, along with corpse photography was spirit photography. Now, I mean, William Pope, this guy, what's to say about William? William started sort of the spirit photography craze, and what he would do is he'd photograph a person or a couple, and then he would take a negative and drop it in, and in the dark room he would burn that negative into the other image, and he'd combine them, right? So the dude, basically made a living and stuff, and acted like he could see people's loved ones, and all he was doing was taking photos and other negatives and dropping them in during the darkroom process, and he was mixing the two negatives together so that it would appear that there were faces and stuff in there, right? So not only was there death photography and corpse photography, but there was like spirit photography. And this is a photograph taken by Hope at a meeting of the Society for the Study of Supernormal Pictures. Right. So Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was in this group, and if you look closely in this group shot, Hope actually took and put a man's photo, looks like horizontally over the guy in the very center. And I've turned it for you so you can sort of see. And there's the guy. You can literally see his eyes. You can see his forehead and stuff. You can literally sort of see like what Hope tried to do and make it look like there's always a spirit around or they're continually being haunted and stuff, right? And here's a last shot of one of his. It's got that woman at the very top, and he made it look like a spirit. So, yeah. Anyway, lots of fun stuff during the advent and the beginnings of photography. A huge fascination with death and spiritual stuff, and they tried to photograph that, right? So this is Edward Muybridge. If he looks like a murderer, he was. and we'll get into that. We'll let him sort of introduce himself and talk a little bit. But yeah, I'm gonna leave it over and give the mic over to, or whatever, over to Muybridge and let him sort of discuss and talk a little bit about himself.
Hi there folks, my name is Edward Muybridge. I was born in April 1830. I was an English photographer known for my pioneering work in photographic studies of motion, and early work in motion picture projection. I was born in England, but when I turned 20 I bailed out of the UK and headed to the United States. I had heard the United States was a chill place. I found a job as a bookseller, first in New York City, then in San Francisco. In 1860, I had planned a return trip to Europe, but I suffered serious head injuries en route in a stagecoach crash in Texas. Have Texas drivers gotten any better in your time? I spent the next few years recuperating in Kingston upon Thames, where I took up professional photography, learned the wet plate collodion process, and secured at least 2 British patents for my inventions. I returned to San Francisco in 1867, although I was never the same after my head injury. Some say my personality was totally different. In 1868, I exhibited large photographs of Yosemite Valley, and began selling popular stereographs of my work. In 1874, I shot and killed Major Harry Larkins. I'm not really proud of this, and before you judge me, you have to know that he was having sexual relations with my wife. So yeah, I was pissed. And remember, I had a head injury. Thankfully a jury of my peers, other white men, acquitted me in a controversial jury trial, on the grounds of justifiable homicide. I guess they felt they would have done the same if they had been in my shoes. In 1875, I decided to celebrate my acquittal, and so I traveled for more than a year in Central America on a photographic expedition. Today, I am most known for pioneering the technique of chronophotography of animal locomotion between 1878 and 1886, which used multiple cameras to capture the different positions in a stride, and for my zoopraxiscope, device for projecting painted motion pictures from glass discs that predated the flexible perforated film strip used in cinematography.
So that was fascinating, right? I mean, who today could go kill their what do you call it? Their I guess the guy that was sleeping with your wife, right, or your lover? The jury acquitted him because they thought, well, dude, yeah, we would have done the same thing. Really? Like, oh my gosh, like, yeah. Anyway, Muybridge was a great mind. I mean, if anything, he's credited with everything we know about sort of like film and stuff and entertainment, like film today. He would be like sort of the grandfather of that, the person who sort of started the whole like technology on films and feature films and anything related to motion and photography. This is your guy. There's actually a little small snippet and lecture that you guys can watch that talks a little bit about his zoopraxiscope and how that worked. Yeah, I mean, it's a great listen, right? And he's super fascinating character, despite the fact that he's actually a murderer. He's not even an alleged murderer. He's a murderer who was acquitted, right? Because he did murder somebody. And here I think these are some examples, you guys, of some of his images he created in his studies to try to figure out how animals walked, right? And how the anatomy and stuff, like, of these animals, like, worked. Yeah, and of course, remember, they didn't have video at this time, right? So this is the next best thing to video. These are literally frames, still frames that he combined and made it so that we could sort of like see the first iterations of like motion pictures and like moving photos, right? And he was really interested in anatomy and how things worked, how men jumped, how they landed, what muscles were interacted during this time, etc. And especially interested in horses, and like he mentioned, like the video suggests, he was able to based on his research, he was able to photograph a horse, right, and then put it together in a zoopraxiscope, and therefore he could show everybody that a horse's legs were off the ground at the same time when it was trotting. A lot of artists up until this point, for 1,000 years, whatever, they were convinced that a horse generally had one leg on the ground all the time, right? That it never fully had all of its legs up. And Muybridge figured it out, right? He figured it out and dispelled the myth and showed that the horse, at a certain point, right, bang, right there, has all of its legs up off the ground. Now this is one of his early projections, and he put this together. And what he did was, the first time he tried this, he had about 12 cameras, because their shutter speeds, you guys, weren't fast enough to photograph this. So he had to use 12 different cameras with a string on them. So as the horse came by, its hooves would hit each string and each camera would go off, and then he'd combine them, right? And then he developed a faster shutter speed later on and was able to recreate some of his experiments. But dude, I honestly, artists were losing their minds, right? Because of this. Because they'd painted it wrong and had drawn it wrong, and all these ancient epic paintings and masterpieces, they'd always drawn horses incorrectly when they were running. So we can thank Muybridge for dispelling that myth, right? This is another guy I would like to talk about a little bit. And honestly, guys, because I want to show you like what photographers can do, and the power of social photography. Now you'll notice here, he died penniless, right? Yeah, he didn't have any money and actually died super broke. But what he was able to do is he was able to sneak into factories and textile mills, and he was able to photograph kids, under the age of like, well, dude, they were like sometimes 10-year-olds and 6-year-olds and stuff. He was able to photograph them in really bad working conditions. And what he was able to do was he brought these images back, and they were a large part of why legislation happened, and they made it a law, that child labor laws came out saying you cannot work a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old with no shoes in the winter, no breaks, 10 hours a day. What? Like, I mean, and then get their hands and their fingers chopped off. They'd lose their limbs because there were no safety constraints on a lot of these big machines and stuff, right? So yeah, I mean, this dude was one of my heroes, okay? And these are some of the shots he did, right? These are some of the images he came back with and showed people so they could see like people working and what happened. And sort of how what a travesty it was for all these kids to be working, right? I mean, this is 9-year-old Minnie Thomas, right? This is her sardine knife. She gets $2 a day and she's 9. I mean, these kids didn't have a chance to go to school or anything, right? So, and then she's a 9-year-old working with a big sharp knife, and she needs to move really fast, cutting sardines. I mean, there's no chance that there's going to be an accident here, right? Well, there were lots of accidents, okay? Here's Katie, 13, and Angeline, 11. They're stitching lace. They're making about $1 a week, right? And what's crazy is you could pay children way less because they were kids, okay? So yeah, a lot of these. This is one of Hein's images. This is Hiram. He's 9, works in a canning company. I ain't very fast, only about 5 boxes a day, and they pay about 5 cents a box. So he's making about $0.25 a day, and he's 9. So, I mean, just seeing these images, you guys, seeing the images and seeing these little kids barefoot, climbing up on textile mills and stuff, there had to be something come out so that they weren't abused and exploited. Even their parents, who were probably broke and really poor also, these probably weren't great decisions to send their little children into these big, vast factories with no safety, nothing, no training. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it just seems like this is a recipe for disaster, and it was, because lots of kids lost appendages, they lost digits, they lost their whatever. They lost a lot of their stuff was cut off and chopped off and got caught, and a lot of them died also, right? Coal mines, of course, were probably not super healthy. These guys don't look like they're over like 10. They all look like they're probably about 10 years old or younger. These guys look a little older, right? And they're working at 9 o'clock at night. And all these images were from Louis Hine, right? And the thing is, what Louis Hine did is he would sneak into the factories. And if you're wondering, like, why would the owners let him in? Well, they didn't. When he first tried to get in, they kicked his butt and punched him and beat him up, right? And left him on the road. And then he thought, you know what? There's probably a better way to do this. So then he tried disguising himself as like a traveling Bible salesman, and that worked out pretty well for a minute. But then after that, they found that out too. And finally, his best disguise, I guess, was he acted like that the catalogs and the people that, or excuse me, the companies that created these textile mills, and the factory parts and the machines, he said that he was from the company that created and designed and manufactured the machines, and the company had sent him to take photos of it for their catalog. So because he was a representative of the machines and their manufacturers, they let him right in and let him photograph whatever they wanted. He was literally no threat. Okay. And then that way he was able to sneak in and take a lot of these photos that we're seeing right now. These guys used to stand out and sell newspapers all night. Yeah, it was just sort of a rough time, for kids. And hopefully we don't go back to this, right? Where we go back to like the early 1900s and say, yeah, a 10-year-old can go work or a 8-year-old can go work. I just think it's something that maybe a country as rich as ours, not to start dropping opinions on all this stuff. But I feel like a country as wealthy as ours, we shouldn't have a 8-year-old out working, 8 to 10 hours a day. 8-year-olds should be able to be kids. And I think, regardless of their economic situation. Yeah. Anyway, these here are oyster shuckers. Super fun, right? This gal, who is it? Rosie, worked 3 a.m. to 5 p.m. Can you believe that crap? And look at that little kid right there that's looking right at us, or looking right at Lewis Hine. Looking right at us, that little kid will be able to pick up a knife pretty quick, right? And they'll be doing oysters. It's just sort of like disheartening, right? And anyway, Lewis Hine took all these photos. He brought them back to important people of society, and they helped lobby and change the laws so that factories could not hire little children and put them in really crappy working conditions. Now, George Eastman was revolutionary, and he helped roll out the Kodak brownie and revolutionized how people took photos. And he was basically, you guys, sort of what a digital camera did, he's basically what a smartphone did for our generation, he did for his generation. Okay? And what I mean by that is before Eastman came out with these little small box cameras that had 100 exposures in them, you really had to get a big camera. You had to put it on a big tripod. You had to have a trigger release. You generally had to put a cape over your head or a cloth over your head, and you had to get people all focused and set up. It was a real big flipping, procedure, right? It took a long time. It took a lot of expertise. It took a lot of technical know-how. And this guy, and only professionals pretty much could do it because it was so flipping technical. This guy comes in and goes, you know what? Guess what? Here's a small little camera. No, professionals don't need to do it anymore. Everybody can take photos with my camera. And and it's going to be awesome. And you guys will be able to bring these around with you, and you'll be able to document your entire lives. Isn't that what we see now with our smartphones? Right? Before, who brought a camera around with them to school every day? Like nobody, right? Nobody brought cameras with them everywhere they went. Nobody held a camera in front of their face and tried to take selfies all the time. Like nobody did that. But now we have smartphones, and we literally walk around with a camera in our pocket. And we document everything, right? We literally document everything we see all day long. All kinds of stuff. If we see a pretty flower, we photograph it and send it to our parents or our friends. We photograph everything all day. That's what happened here. This is one of the little cameras he developed. This is the Kodak Brownie. He would take that little film on the bottom right. He would drop it in there and scroll it all in there. And then he would send it out to these people. They would shoot their 100 frames, their 100 exposures, their 100 photographs. And then they would send it back into him. He would develop it. He would re-roll the film for him. and he would send the camera back to them with a new roll of film with 100 shots on it, and he'd also send back to them their prints, their 100 prints. What a great freaking business model, right? By sending back the film and the camera preloaded, he guaranteed that they had to send it back to him to get it out and develop it. Now look, the marketing has been the same forever, right? This goes back to like, I mean, dude, the early 1900s, right? Early 1900s, over 100 years ago, and they're still saying, you press the button, we do the rest, right? The only camera that anybody can use without instructions. Doesn't that sound like our change from like our professional cameras here and then our switch to smartphones, right? Anybody can take a smartphone photo. You just push the button. It's great, right? And it'll fit in your pocket. Put a Kodak in your pocket. So all of these, you guys, were very, very much like in this revolution, this bringing cameras to the common people, right, that weren't experts, weren't photographers, weren't technicians, and didn't have all that technical skill and the money to buy these cameras. This brought photography home to everybody. So people started taking pictures of everything. Just like what happened with our smartphones. Like if you look in your camera roll and you literally got photos of all kinds of stuff. You have photos of yourself. You have photos probably of notes, class notes on the board. You've probably got like the last time you flew somewhere. You've got the like G11 from the airport parking lot to remind you. I mean, dude, we take pictures of everything these days, and these guys started doing the same thing. They're out on vacation. They're just chilling, enjoying a picnic. These gentlemen, right? All these are photos taken with Kodak Brownie. They took pictures of their kids when they took pictures of a cool elephant when they went to the circus, right? I mean, they took pictures of a day at the beach. I mean, these are exactly the same type of stuff that we shoot. I mean, this gal over here, this guy's reading, and this gal over here has got her outfit with her typical pose with her hand on her hip, and she's like, check this fit out. And by the way, look at my cool hat, right? But they took pictures of everything. The light in this image, I think, is absolutely flippin' beautiful. A little overexposed, but I think it's great, right? And here we have them taking pictures of their kids. Oh, that's a duplicate, it looks like. Yeah, they literally photographed everything. And lastly, here is a photo of, I think this is the first known photo of guys having a beer. That's literally this. This is the first photo of just dudes having a beer. So, basically, you guys, the upshot of what I want you to know is that these are sort of the important hallmarks of photography and getting to where we are today. The camera obscura, the dark room, is basically just like our smartphone and just like every other camera. And we had some interesting people that came along and helped us out and innovated and made technology advances so that we could have the smartphone that we have today.